It's game night, and you've prepared an awesome adventure for you and your friends. The party will finally be arriving at the majestic white gates of the city of Marinth, on their way to the Queen's court to carry a message from her son. You've written up notes with great descriptions of the court, several locations in the city, and NPCs to fill these places. So far, however, the players don't seem to be making much progress past the gates. You see, on their way into the city, one of the players asked about the guards. Guards? Yeah, of course there are guards. You hadn't thought of any guards.
What's your name, sir?
Oh, name. Yeah, the name's, Charles.
What are you doing tonight, Charles? Care to join us for a drink at the inn?
A drink? I can't. I have to work. You know, guarding.
Work? Don't you have any hobbies?
Yeah, sure. I like to, play darts and, guard stuff. Ouch, that could have gone a lot better. If this sounds at all familiar to you, I hate to break it to you, but your NPCs are boring. Let's talk. Hi everybody and welcome to WASD 20. My name is Nate and today's video is all about making your NPCs better. You mean that video where he called our D&D combat boring is a part of a series? It is now. Buckle up. Alright, so let's get into it. The tips I want to share with you today are, first of all, how to make your NPCs memorable and unique. Secondly, how you can make them believable. And thirdly, how you can make them useful. Now, I fully recognize that the example I gave in the intro is really more a failure to improvise rather than the failure of creating an interesting NPC. But I do think that improv is incredibly important when you're creating NPCs for your game. And so we will get to that. I promise that will be a main point of this video toward the end. First, I want to talk about when you're preparing NPCs, how you can do so in a way that makes for good NPCs and a smooth experience at the table. So the first tip I want to give you is how to make your NPCs memorable and unique. And really, I think these two things go hand in hand. When they are unique, they are also memorable. So how can you make them unique? Well, I think that scars, missing limbs, a tick or a strange mannerism, maybe a unique tattoo, an interesting garment, or oddly colored eyes. These sorts of strange characteristics can make for a very unique NPC, and personally I think they're just a lot of fun. Now, do consider the tone of your game. If you're going for a more serious and realistic tone, then maybe you don't want to have too much of these. But I would say that even if you are playing in a fairly low fantasy world that doesn't have a lot of these crazy things going on, that your fantasy game world can still handle more of these strange characteristics per capita than actual medieval Europe or feudal Japan or whatever flavor of fantasy you happen to be playing in. So certainly don't go around giving every single NPC some crazy quirk, but do put a lot of these into your NPCs and they can make for more interesting non-player characters that your players can get into. So there are some examples of some of these odd characteristics both in the Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D 5th edition and in the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide, which are two excellent books I highly recommend. Even though I never play Pathfinder anymore, I always use that Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide because it's got so many system agnostic tools for Dungeon Masters. Another way that you can make your non-player characters unique and memorable is by giving them names that don't sound a lot like other names. Now, I have to admit I have been guilty of this at times. Introducing 2 or 3 NPCs in one session that, oops, they all have names that start with the same letter. Things like that. I actually had a group who did this to me once. I swear it was some kind of cruel trick to publicly embarrass me. It was in my Oath of the Frozen King game that I ran almost 2 years ago now. I had 4 players and they all created characters that had their names starting with the letter R, and I had the hardest time keeping track of them. There was Rinnick and Ruthgar and Rufus and Ravodoran, and yeah, it made my life a little bit difficult. So that was a kind of a funny coincidence. Don't do that to your players. Likewise, if you want them to be memorable, give them names they can actually pronounce and remember and that don't have the craziest spelling you could possibly imagine. This probably depends a lot on the group, but I have found that names that are too long and too unwieldy, I, as the Dungeon Master, have trouble remembering, let alone the players. So take it easy on them and try to err on the side of shorter names. 2-syllable, maybe 3 sometimes. Keeping them grounded in names that are at least close to real-world names can actually help them be slightly more memorable and less unwieldy. But, you know, go with the tone of your game and what you're comfortable with and what your group can handle. But anyway, one last way that you can make your NPCs more unique and memorable is by switching the way that they talk a little bit. Now, this could be getting into accents. Personally, I enjoy busting out all the accents. I'll do my bad Russian, I'll do my bad Irish, I'll do all that and I'll have a lot of fun with it, but I know that that's not everybody's thing, and that's okay. But you can even just switch the intonation a little bit, the inflection, the pace at which they talk. And all of these things can really make a big difference in making your NPCs feel unique and different from one another. And if you find yourself switching to the same default NPC voice every time, which honestly I struggle with a bit, try actually writing down ahead of time on a note card what sort of accent they have, or they talk like this person. Sometimes that can be really helpful. Or just talk slower, talk fast, talk high, talk low. And don't be afraid to try accents if you feel comfortable doing so. Personally, I have a lot of fun with that. In addition to making your NPCs unique and memorable, I also think it's important to make them believable. Get into the heads of your NPCs and try to inhabit them as actual beings in your game world, and you'll have a lot more success. Think about their motivations, think about what makes them tick, think about their past and their backstory a little bit, but don't get too detailed on this. More on that in a minute. One easy way to do this is to think about some characters from popular works of fiction or characters that you are really familiar with. This is a tip that Michael Shea gives in Sly Flourishes, The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, which I have absolutely been loving, recently released. I'll put a link down in the video description. Great book. And he also talks about that if you're afraid that these are going to be too recognizable by your players, in terms of like, oh, this is basically like Harry Potter, or this is Jon Snow, spot on. One easy tip is to switch the gender. Now, I also recommend maybe trying to pick archetypes and characters from works of fiction that your players might not be familiar with. That's another way you can avoid that problem. But chances are they're not going to recognize where that character is from. And don't be afraid to basically copy characters from other works of fiction. The third tip, make sure your NPCs are useful to your game. Now, that's kind of why NPCs are there in the first place, but more than just kind of fleshing out and filling the roles in the game world, think about how they can be even more useful. Think about how your NPCs can reveal bits of the main mystery. How are they reflecting what's going on in the game world or some of the things that have happened? What are their opinions on recent world events? Do they have a family member who's been affected by something that's going on? Or have they themselves been affected? Whatever your main drive is for the narrative or where you feel the players are taking it, make the NPCs come along and be useful toward that end and fleshing that out. I also recommend tying NPCs in with your player characters. Think about maybe family members or former associates of the player characters, and don't be afraid to say, hey, we're actually going to be passing by your character's hometown. Let's talk, between games, a little bit more about your family life and your upbringing, and then maybe you can have a family member show up as an NPC in the next game. Tie in members of their faction or just NPCs that you think will resonate with the player characters because you know the player character backstory or personality. So before we get to the fourth tip, which is about improv, as I promised, let's talk a little bit about what you might want to have ready for the NPCs you have planned. So you're considering how to make them memorable and unique, you're considering how to make them believable and useful, but what should you actually have ready? Well, the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5e and the Game Master Guide for Pathfinder have huge sections on all this stuff you can have for NPCs. And that's useful stuff, but I recommend when you first come to the table to keep it really, really simple. Sly Flourish recommends just having one 3x5 note card. Something like this. Just keep it simple. This is even a bit more detailed. I've ran this NPC for 2 sessions, so I've gathered a bit more information about him, and I've got a lot more up here, But keep it really simple. Sticking to a 3x5 note card can ensure that you're not wasting too much time. That's the key to the lazy dungeon master method, is you don't want to be wasting time. You want to spend more time on the things that really are going to pay dividends at the table. And the reality is that if you're slaving over this elaborate backstory for this NPC and this rich physical description, he could be dead within 20 minutes of the game starting, because that's the way players are sometimes. Dungeon masters, back me up on this. Let me know if that's ever happened to you down in the comments below. Keeping it simple in the beginning can also give you the ability to kind of change the NPC to be useful in the way that your players' characters are interacting with them and their story can begin to be formed. Write your NPCs as you do with your world building in wet cement and make them a little bit changeable. I've mentioned in other videos, I think that's also important when you're building a player character. Don't go too crazy on the backstory. A lot of that's a matter of taste, and you should do what works for you at the table. But I would recommend that if you're going to err on the side of keeping it brief. So what are some things you want to have on the card? Well, I would recommend probably having their name. I would recommend having a physical description, or at least something up here, and probably having a note about their personality or some kind of characteristic for them. If you want to get more detailed, you can start to think about their motivation. You can start to think about the things the 5 ebooks recommend, which is, of course, flaws and bonds. Think about dark secrets and things they might be hiding. But for me, you can see I generally keep it really simple, and once that NPC has showed up a couple times and I have a reasonable degree of confidence that they'll continue to show up, if I want to make them a major NPC, a major character in the story, then I'll start to fill out a lot more of the motivation and goals. And what are they up to when the player characters aren't around, and what are they building toward? Those sorts of things can be helpful for the major NPCs of your story, but don't do that with all of them, because if you're making all of your NPCs the major NPCs, then none of them are major NPCs. So yeah, I think you get the idea on what you should have ready at the table. It really just depends on your style. In terms of preparing NPC stat blocks, I definitely don't recommend doing that unless you're reasonably sure that this person is going to see combat either against the player characters or with them. And even so, don't go trying to build these from scratch. Just use the ones in the back of the monster manual here if you're playing 5th edition. There's stat blocks for cultists, for bandits, for guards, and even commoner, which is really, really handy. And personally, even though I have this at my fingertips at the table, I often don't even use them. I just make up stats that make sense on the spot, and that sort of thing just comes with experience. Lastly, we gotta talk about improvisation, because that is one of the big keys to making good NPCs, making interesting NPCs, is being prepared to improv. You as the Dungeon Master just cannot spend time prepping every conceivable thing. So being prepared to improv is huge in general, and especially I think with NPCs. So one of the keys to this, and something Sly Flourish definitely recommends, is having a name list. And he actually has a name list in here. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of his name list. I don't like the naming conventions that he uses all that much. So I actually went ahead and made my own, and of course here I am sharing that with you. This is the WASD 20 Fantasy NPC list. So I think the main useful part here is just the names. If you choose to ignore the race, appearance, personal characteristics, and make that stuff up yourself, that's totally fine. Of course, tweak anything. I recommend printing it out and scribbling all over the thing. So if you look down here, there's about 45 of them in total, and I do have name, surname, race, appearance, and personal characteristics, which is mostly going to be personality traits. You might notice that the races do lean pretty heavily toward human, dwarf, elf, and some halflings, but there are a few others scattered in as well. But that's just the nature of my game world that doesn't have as many of the kind of fringe races, a little more traditional fantasy in that sense. So you can feel free to tweak that as you see fit, and I think some of the names could easily be switched to other races, and you can just say, actually, I think this one right here is a tiefling. And there you go, no problem. Print it out, scribble all over the thing. I think this really is perfect for that town guard situation, because I don't think it makes sense to prep a name and a short backstory for every town guard and every patron in the tavern. Rather, if your players decide they want to engage with one of these folks, then you can come up with a name on the spot using this list. So you need a name for that town guard, and you just scan down your list and you say, ah, perfect. Okay, so his name is Arik Megweather. And now you just write in here Town Guard, Marinth, so you have a note about that for the future if you think your player characters might actually encounter this NPC again sometime, or you want to use them again. Some people might also prefer to keep some index cards handy at the table so that you can actually write down the name from this list onto a note card and have a note card for each NPC in your campaign. And certainly this list also comes in handy when I'm preparing for a session of D&D and I'm preparing some NPCs. I might have one that I really like on here that I want to use as my main villain or as a major quest giver and ally of the player characters. So use it as you see fit and give me any feedback down in the comments. One final thing I should throw in here is don't overwhelm your players with too many NPCs. I would say in every session, maybe you want to prepare 1, 2, maybe 3 NPCs. I made the mistake actually a couple months ago is that when my players boarded a ship, there was a crew of like, 10 people aboard this ship and my player characters. And I started saying, oh, and then there's this guy, and then there's this guy, and this woman, and this lady, and it just got a little bit overwhelming, I felt, in the NPC department. You don't want your players to feel like Bilbo Baggins in Chapter 1 of The Hobbit, where he's just opening the door and dwarf after dwarf is bursting in with some odd name and feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Finally, if you are looking for some ways to flesh out your library with resources to build better NPCs, definitely recommend you check out the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5e. There's a whole chapter on NPCs in this book, as well as the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide. As I mentioned, the 5e Monster Manual also has great NPC stat blocks in the back. And lastly, don't forget The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. These books are so good, just short books full of practical tips, and there's even a workbook that you can get as well. I recommend getting both of them. I'll put links to all these books down in the video description, and most of those will be Amazon affiliate links, which means that when you use them, it does help support this channel at no extra cost to you. All right, that's all for this one, everybody. I want to thank my patrons so much for their support of this channel. It is instrumental in making sure that these videos keep coming, keeping me motivated, and keeping the lights on around here. So thank you, patrons, for your support. You can learn more at patreon.com/WASD20. Also, consider joining the WASD20 Discord server. It's totally free. It used to be locked to only patrons, but I've opened it up to anybody, and I would love to have you come in. The thing is starting to grow a little bit, and that's great to see a lot of good conversations happening. Just a great place to hang out and talk role-playing games. All right, that's all for this one, everybody. Take care. You'll see me again very soon.